Well, it's been an interesting week for the estate tax community, especially here in Minnesota. On the federal side, we've had an introduction of a bill to repeal the estate tax in full. This is interesting timing because at the end of this year, on December 31st, 2025, the federal estate tax exemption will be cut in half. At the same time, in the Minnesota House, we've had an introduction of a bill to completely repeal the Minnesota estate tax. And that exemption has not changed for several years. So what do these proposals mean for your farm? Well, let's get into it. Welcome to Farm Lawyer. I'm Jason Wagner. I help farmers, landowners, and rural families protect their land, secure their legacy, and protect what they built. Today we're talking about estate taxes again. I know it's a topic that I've covered a lot on this channel, but it is that important. Virtually every farm client that comes into my office has an estate tax issue or a potential estate tax issue. That's why I spend so much time talking about it. A lot of these clients don't even have an idea that this issue exists or how detrimental it can be to their operation. But we do have some potential relief out there. One is on the federal side. As I just mentioned, the federal exemption is set to cut in half at the end of this year. So every person out there right now has an historically high exemption of $13.99 million. That means that you can pass during life or at death $13.99 million worth of assets. However, on December 31st, 2025, without an act of Congress passing a tax bill that gets signed into law, that exemption amount is going to get cut in half, which means it will be roughly $7 million on January 1st, 2026. So if you're a farmer and you have, let's say, a $10 million estate, right now you don't have a federal estate tax issue, but in a few months you will. And it won't be a small issue. It could be a huge issue because the federal estate tax rate is 40%. So if you have a $10 million estate and you have your $7 million exemption, that means $3 million of your assets could be subject to a 40% estate tax. When you tack Minnesota's estate tax onto it, we could be looking at 50% of those assets being subject to estate taxes. I don't know of a single farm that could withstand that type of expense. And even if you could, we're talking about something that's going to be paid for the next 20 plus years. That means if we get it into the hand of the next generation, which might be generation 5, 6, or 7, they could be spending their entire careers paying back that estate tax. Not to mention that they also have to plan to how to get it to their next generation. And are we just going to be having to pay for it again? So this proposal on the federal side would completely repeal the estate tax. I know that would help a lot of farming families out there. The reality is farming is hugely capital intensive. We have the land base, which the value just keeps going up, but we have no control over that. I don't know of any farmer that has doubled their income in the last few years just because the value of their land has doubled, which means that the return on their investment is going down. At the same time, machinery and equipment values have crept up quite a bit. These are 100,000 plus machines that you need to have in order to be able to do your job. So the estate tax can come in and really do some damage if we don't make sure we have a good estate plan in place. If you consider that a farm might have a return on investment of a few percentage points, at a 40% rate, that can take years and years of farm profit to pay back. Sometimes we hear that family farms don't pay the estate tax or that the estate tax doesn't really impact family farms. Well, last year, the United States Department of Agriculture released a report that said that if the estate tax sunsets at the end of 2025, as we expected to do without an act of Congress, the number of farms that are projected to pay the estate tax will triple. That's coming from the federal government that is telling us that yes, this will impact farmers, and yes, it will triple the number of farmers that pay estate tax. So that's on the federal side. In Minnesota, we did have a bill introduced to repeal the Minnesota estate tax. Now, the Minnesota estate tax is a much lower exemption. It's $3 million, plus farmers get a $2 million deduction if their land qualifies, which means in effect we get $5 million of protection for a farmer, assuming we can check all the right boxes. Unlike on the federal side, the Minnesota exemption is not tied to inflation. It's not set to adjust at any certain time. It's just a number that was fixed by the Minnesota legislature And until they act to change it or repeal it, it is fixed in that spot for perpetuity. Now, the average farm size in Minnesota, I believe, is around 300 or 400 acres, which means that at $10,000 an acre, or maybe even $13,000 an acre, virtually every average farmer in Minnesota is potentially subject to the Minnesota estate tax. So, if we get that land base of a few hundred acres, 10,000, 13,000 an acre, add some machinery and equipment onto it, livestock or grain. Plus, then we also have to remember that any life insurance, CDs, emergency savings, that's all going to be taxed too. So the Minnesota estate tax at the current levels is set up so that it will tax the average farmer at death. That's just the way it is. These are facts. There's no way around that. Now, if we look to our neighbors around us, we're a bit of an island. Wisconsin does not have an estate tax. Iowa is phasing theirs out. South Dakota does not have an estate tax. North Dakota does not have an estate tax. Minnesota does. And, Minnesota has a large and vibrant agricultural economy. But that estate tax exemption is low enough that it impacts the average farmer. Now, as I've mentioned in other videos, there are some estate planning strategies we can employ to make sure that we're maximizing our protection. But the Minnesota estate tax as it exists now is not designed to tax the top 10% of farmers or the top 25% of farmers. It's designed to tax the average farmer. If we take a farmer of $5 million of net worth, and if they're still paying down debt, they may be only netting $50,000 of income out of that farm. So I don't know anybody that would say that that's, a wealthy farm. So the point is, the exemption as it exists is taxing your average farmer, not your wealthy farmer. That's why I spend so much time talking about it, because it impacts virtually all of my clients. And when we consider on the federal side that the rollback is going to pull the exemption from around 14 million to 7 million, all we're doing is taxing the less wealthy, those that have fewer assets that are not subject to the federal estate tax today, but would be a year from now. And there was a committee hearing in the Minnesota bill, and some questions came up that I addressed on this channel. One of those is, well, is it actually family farms that we're worried about? What about farms that are in LLCs or corporations? LLCs or corporations are a very important planning tool that we use for family farms all the time. They help with the transition. They can help us with some other types of planning, but we shouldn't assume that just because we see it in an LLC or a corporation that it's not a family farm. In fact, Minnesota has a corporate farm law that the legislature in the 1970s put out that says that all LLCs and corporations that engage in farming or have an interest in farmland must register with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and be qualified as a family farm. So these are not Wall Street brokers or foreign entities that are engaging in ownership of farmland through these LLCs and corporations. By law, they must be family farm LLCs and family farm corporations. One of the other points raised was about unrealized gains and about the discussion that the average homeowner may not be subject to estate tax, but they pay a tax on unrealized gains of their property every year through a property tax. Well, that's an interesting argument, and I think it has some weight to it because, right, the value of your house goes up and you pay more in property taxes, yet you haven't sold it. So you're being taxed on your wealth. It's a wealth tax that you pay every year through property taxes. It taxes unrealized gains. Well, guess what? Farm values have also gone up significantly in the last few years. In some cases, they've doubled. A farm that was being sold for $5,000 an acre maybe 6 years ago could be selling for $13,000 an acre today. And you better believe that's reflected on the property tax statements in the property taxes that they pay every year. So just like with the homeowner paying property taxes every year on those unrealized capital gains, farmers pay a wealth tax every year through their property taxes as well. With farmland typically being the bulk of a farmer's net worth, that means that they are essentially paying a wealth tax every year through property taxes, and then could be taxed on it again when they die with it. So how does this tie into the farm succession plan? We have to keep all of this in mind. If you have an estate plan where your farming heir maybe has to buy out their non-farming siblings, we have to factor in that they may also be paying an estate tax bill, because even the average farm or small farm in Minnesota is potentially subject to the Minnesota estate tax because of the exemption limits that exist. But again, with smart estate planning and thinking through your farm transition plan, we can plan around and anticipate a lot of these issues. And if the objective is to preserve the family farm and protect family farms in general, we need to make sure that we have good tax planning around that. Otherwise, we're just going to see an acceleration and consolidation of farming into fewer and fewer hands, which will get us to the exact point of corporate farming, which is what the Minnesota legislature for 50 plus years has said they want to avoid. So if we want family farms to continue, we need to make sure that being proactive and intentional about that, as well as having a tax policy that allows it to transition to the next generation in a smart way. Now, if you'd like to know what you can do on your estate plan or your farm transition plan to try to get ahead of it, visit farmlawyer.com, follow me, click to subscribe, drop a comment below, and let me know what you think.